Generation 3 games are some of the most beloved in the entire franchise. Most people remember it for having a diverse, strong assortment of new Pokemon, or just for having too much water. But I don't think people quite realize just how many mediocre to straight up bad Gen 3 Pokemon there are. And that's why today I want to focus on a couple of Hoenn's most underwhelming Pokemon and see how and if we can at least make them somewhat better for a playthrough. I'm not going to be talking about obvious gimmick Pokemon like Lubdisk and Spinda, even though they're terrible since they were made for collecting. I'm going over Pokemon that I feel could have been pretty good but ended up being surprisingly weak. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It helps out the channel and lets me know you want to see more of these Pokemon stats videos. With that being said, let's look at the first underwhelming Pokemon. If I were to ask you what fully evolved Pokemon has the lowest base stat total besides Shedinja, what would you say? Most would probably say Kricketune, and you're correct. But if I were to ask you this exact question 8 years ago, you'd actually be wrong. That's because that spot used to be held by Delcatty with a mere 380 base stat total. It did get an extra 20 speed in Gen 7, making it have a 90 base speed, but that isn't really helping it in any way as every other stat is mediocre at best. What makes its abysmal stats even stranger is that Skitty, its pre-evolution, is incredibly rare in the Gen 3 games, only being found in one route and very rarely at that. And to top it all off, it evolves using a Moonstone. And where's the first place you can get a Moonstone? Meteor Falls. So you're stuck with an even worse Pokemon for almost half the game. Now, all is not terrible. The Skitty line has two things that make it special. Firstly, contests. Yeah, remember those? One of the many experimental features introduced in Gen 3 that a grand total of 5 people ended up seriously using. Delcatty is actually a really good contest Pokemon, but this is about improving underwhelming Pokemon in battle, and unfortunately, its only unique thing in that field is being the only Pokemon to know Assist in Gen 3, which is a move that randomly picks any move from your team. So it's pretty clear that Delcatty isn't meant to be an offensive beast. Its Pokédex entry literally states that it dislikes fighting, so turning it into a sweeper would be inappropriate. I think that increasing its speed in Gen 7 was the right call, but we could definitely bump it up further to around 110 to 115. Other cat Pokemon like Persian and, Perugly of all things, have relatively high speed stats, so why not Delcatty as well? I'd also make it meatier on the HP side and slightly bulkier defensively. Like, seriously, those defensive stats are just awful, especially for a Pokemon that has a lot of support potential. I also think that its encounter rate should be significantly increased so that people can actually find one. A couple of moves that I would add to its level up move list are Baton Pass for obvious reasons, Encore to trap opposing Pokemon, and Memento, because a Memento is a keepsake, and I mean also, the fluffy tail is literally based off of a Skitty's tail. Finally, for the Gen 3 remakes, I'd also give it an extra fairy type because, you know what, we might as well make every single pink thing part fairy, and I mean it would also make it a lot better in battle. I think these changes enhance the supportive / assist role that Delcatty could have filled in while not giving crazy unrealistic changes. Quick question, did anyone else used to think that this thing was bug water for the longest time? Surskit is, but strangely, masquerain becomes a boring bug flying type. I don't know, maybe it's just some kind of like personal Mandela effect? Anyway, this thing really got the short end of the stick, just like a lot of other Gen 3 Pokemon. Surskit is yet another that was made unnecessarily rare, but isn't really great. It's only found in a couple of routes in Ruby and Sapphire with a 1% encounter rate, and only in Swarms in Emerald. At its introduction, this was Masquerain's stat distribution. It did end up getting a pretty big buff in Gen 7, but I still don't think it's worth using. It's in a similar position as Delcatty, but nowhere near as dire and has potential to be a threat. So let's see what we can improve starting in the stats department. Even with the biggest stat buff in Pokemon history, Masquerain still isn't a great Pokemon. Looking at both its pre and post buff stat distribution, it's clear that Masquerain is meant to be specially oriented. However, I think its special attack stat is just fine. What this forgotten bug really needs is a defense and speed boost. Its moth-like appearance and dex entry stating that it can fly like a helicopter is really misleading given its mediocre 80 speed and almost criminal 60 speed before Gen 7. So why don't we bump it up a notch to around 120? And it wouldn't hurt to give it some much needed special defense points while we're at it. With a higher special defense stat, masquerain can tank electric attacks better and also counter physical attacks with intimidate. For its moveset, oh god. We get a grand total of 1 water, bug, and flying type move each. In all honesty, I could probably make an entire video talking about how bad the old Pokemon movesets were. Unfortunately, because of the physical special split, masquerain will still suffer in the original games. I'd give it Water Pulse as a level up move to replace Water Sport since it lives near ponds, and also because Water Sport is just useless. Signal Beam since it needs a better bug move than Silver Wind, and Giga Drain for extra coverage, Mud Shot since I'd imagine wet places to be pretty muddy and also for ground type coverage. And finally Glare instead of Sunspore so masquerain can consistently paralyze Pokemon, which fits its theme of being intimidating to look at. Lastly, one major change I'd give it is to change its typing from Bug Flying to Bug Water. I know that Araquanid exists now, but it's got a completely different role, so I think it's fine. And plus, it's a much better typing that still suits it. And now we have 2 Gen 3 Pokemon that have become forgotten due to being unusually rare and not good. Wow, what a surprise, right? Seriously, what was Game Freak thinking when coming up with the stats for these Pokemon? I put these 2 Pokemon together since they're clearly counterparts to each other and have pretty similar stats with a few differences. Unfortunately, these balanced stats are just mediocre all around. It makes one wonder why they're only found in one route in their debut region. Of course, only being found well after the second gym. At least in Gen 2, there was Heracross, which was cryptically rare but strong. Here, we have 2 Pokemon that don't even have a stat above 90. To start things off, why not literally light up the Hoenn dex a bit and give these 2 boring Fireflies the electric type? Gen 3 has only the Manectric line, Plusle, and Minun for new electric types, so spreading the love is much appreciated. Now, as for stats, here is where I think the 2 get very different treatments. Volbeat should have a much higher special attack stat than physical attack since it's the one with Tail Glow, so it's kinda pointless having it with a base 47 special attack. As for illumise, its support-oriented move list in Gen 3 makes me feel like it should have a bulkier distribution instead. It would also be kinda cool to see Cosmic Power on it since it's kinda fitting due to it already having Moonlight, or at least some good stat boosting move like Quiver Dance in newer games to take advantage of its ability to Baton Pass. As for general level up moves, adding Charge Beam and Volt Switch to both could give them some nice potential, and in the original Gen 3 games, maybe something like Spark and Signal Beam to both. You're probably scratching your head right now since I literally just covered 2 counterparts, so why am I only mentioning Seviper and not Zangoose? Well, I think Zangoose's stat distribution is fine as is, so the only thing that I think could be improved is just making its stats higher. Seviper, on the other hand, is, yeah. Talk about wasted potential. It's pretty neat having equally good offensive stats and a surprisingly great move pool, but that doesn't matter when you can't outspeed or take a hit. Unfortunately, Seviper suffers from being a late game Pokemon that doesn't offer enough to be wanted, which, as you'll see, is going to be a trend for the rest of this video. So stat-wise, I feel Seviper can easily be fixed with one simple change, making it faster. Seriously, why does it feel like so many Gen 3 Pokemon are unnecessarily slow? Seviper could function as a fantastic sweeper in the Hoenn games with a speed stat of just 100 or higher, plus the poison type was seriously lacking until Gen 6. As for new potential moves, I would give it Sword Stance to allow it to potentially sweep, Sludge Bomb because it seems like Game Freak just forgot to give it to any poison types, Giga Drain because Leech Life sucks in Gen 3, and maybe Dig for some steel coverage before you get Flamethrower? I don't know. And for a second ability, having Intimidate or Poison Point would also be nice. What I do know though is that these changes will go a long way into making Seviper a desirable choice on one's team. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about gimmick Pokemon since most of them were designed to be weak and just for collecting, but castform is an exception since its gimmick revolves around battling. On paper, it seems cool. A Pokemon that can change its type based on the weather? Why wouldn't you want to use that? Well, when you look at its stats, you can kinda see why it's been forgotten. 70 in every stat means that it can't do anything well. I'm assuming that Game Freak might have thought that making it good would be too powerful, but 70 is just too weak. Now, this one's kind of fun. An interesting way to make castform a more fun and memorable Pokemon to use would be to make each of its forms have a unique stat distribution. In its base form, I think that it having a base stat total of 420 is fine, maybe make it a little more skewed towards speed, but its forms should all have a total of 480 instead. Its rain form should be slower and bulkier, its hail form should be a glass cannon, and its sunny form could be more mixed. Lastly, the only thing I changed with its moveset is to give it recover due to water's cleansing properties, and castform is based off of a water molecule. This would incentivize having weather moves on your team and also make castform a worthy Pokemon to use in a playthrough. You know what? I take back saying that Seviper was wasted potential because here we have one of the most disappointing Pokemon of all time. It has all of the ingredients to make an underwhelming Pokemon. Late game, rare, disappointing stats, and a disappointing move pool. By the time you can catch a Tropius, there are already far better grass and flying types, so most people opt to just make it an HM user since it can learn 5 of them. Stat-wise, Tropius is very balanced, but not in a good way. Its health and speed are the standouts, with more health and a lot less speed. However, every other stat is just average. I think that both of its defensive stats should be around 100 and its special attack should be buffed to around 85. Now, I know 85 isn't really all that high, but this will stay faithful to its bulky distribution and design, but also give it some much needed strength, seeing as its move list is largely composed of attacking moves. Speaking of which, let's fix up this level up move list, which is abysmal. Its only flying type move is Gust, which just makes no sense. So let's replace Whirlwind with Air Cutter for a decent upgrade over Gust, and then maybe if you want later you can replace it with Fly. Tropius would also love getting Leech Seed by level up since, it has fruits on its neck, so it being able to create seeds isn't too out there, and this would complement its high HP. If you want to be a little riskier, Curse could also be learned by level up since he'll probably be going slower in the first place. Finally, for some coverage, I'd let it learn Rock Tomb and Rock Slide by TM to cover its ice and fire weaknesses, and lastly, Outrage. This one's going to be pretty controversial, but I think it works. Tropius is based off of a sauropod, so while it prefers not to fight if threatened, I can absolutely see Tropius going berserk. It could probably be its last level up move. With these new moves and stat changes, I feel like Tropius could finally get the love it's been craving for over 20 years. It doesn't have to have the world's highest stats, but what it has right now is almost a crime. And finally, we have a Pokemon that I genuinely feel has absolutely no purpose to exist outside of its introduction, and I'm talking about the poor little wind chime. If you've never used a Chimecho on your team before, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, I'd say that you're doing yourself a favor since this thing can't do anything better than any other psychic type in Hoenn besides, well, being cute. Take a look at its stats. Yeah, they're not horrible, but in a game where you can use Alakazam, Metagross, and Gardevoir, why would you want to use it? And by the way, these are the post-buff stats. This is what it used to have. So in Gen 3, it's on the same level as Pokemon such as Linoone and Mightyena. The difference is that those are found at the very beginning of the game. Whoa, where is Chimecho found, you may be asking? Well, I'll tell you, on the top of Mount Pyre, with a 1% chance of being found. And to top it all off, it got a baby form the next generation. Imagine if something like Farfetch got a pre-evolution instead of an evolution in Gen 8. That's how ridiculous that is. You're better off using Grumpig instead, and that's saying a lot. I genuinely don't think anything can realistically be done to Chimecho itself to make it a top tier Pokemon. It would probably need a whole new evolution, and possibly even more, but here are some small fixes that I think could at least make it the tiniest bit appealing in the Gen 3 games. First of all, Chimecho needs a lot more speed to make it stand out. I think somewhere around 95 would give it somewhat of an edge since it could then outspeed Gardevoir, Grumpig, and Metagross. Now, my second change is kind of reaching, but I'd make Chimecho part Steel type. Steel Psychic is a great typing due to its many resistances, and this pairs well with its many support moves. However, if you wanted to use it offensively, you still could, as it could strike first and hit decently hard. It would basically become a Metagross that you could use earlier, since Beldum can't be obtained until post-game. Unfortunately, there aren't any good steel moves in Gen 3 that suit its design besides maybe Iron Defense and Metal Sound, but steel attacks don't really matter with its poor physical attack. By level up, the only things I'd replace are Psywave with extra sensory, since Psywave is a completely useless move, and I mean it gets it in future generations, so I don't see why I can't get it here. And then Takedown with Cosmic Power, since the Wind Chime it's based on is used to ward off evil, so being able to tap into supernatural powers isn't too out of the question. But sadly, that's it. There's not much else I feel can be done that makes sense. I mean, maybe in later generations it could get Rattled as a second ability to help cover its Dark and Ghost weaknesses from Gen 6 onward, but either way, will these major changes be enough to convince players to want to use a late game, easily skippable, incredibly overshadowed Pokemon that's been lost in time? Well, I don't know, and sadly, since these are just hypothetical changes, we might never know.